Hello. Welcome,
Hello.
everybody.
Oh, sorry.
Hello. Welcome to this talk today with Kyle Pierce. And we are going to be talking about, or Kyle is going to be talking about the multipolar zodiac. So we're going to be exploring gender through Kyle's lenses. And I'm really excited to have you here. And so I'm just going to read your bio to give people a sense of who you are. Some pretty awesome experience. So these are in your words. I am a professional astrologer and host of the podcast Astrology Hotline. Before practicing astrology, I'm switching. You worked in the field of bodywork and holistic health and majored in history with a focus on women and gender in early modern Europe at Oakland University. Your work as an astrologer incorporates a blend of techniques from Hellenistic and Psychological Astrology and emphasizes using narrative to empower people to live more conscious and fulfilling lives. And I think it's just awesome and cool that you would have majored in women and gender, period.
Yeah. It's a topic that seems to just show up in my life a lot somehow. And I guess it seems significant because, I mean, there's a lot of important work and sort of dialogue going on, I think, collectively around the topic. So I'm honored to, be able to offer my humble contribution maybe to the discussion, but because I, intend to leave, more or less open to personal interpretation, because I know that, and especially as we dig maybe into the multipolar zodiac, right, we'll get a sense maybe that gender, when it comes to the way it's applied to astrology, is maybe a lot more complex and nuanced and kind of open to interpretation. It's never really been a static concept really in historically in like different cultures. I mean, different societies and different cultures have sort of different ways of perceiving gender, or different sort of expectations and privileges associated with it. There's kind of some underlying themes. Most societies are generally pretty patriarchal. And astrology represents that pretty well and pretty interestingly, and actually a much more nuanced way than maybe, certainly more than I was introduced to when I first got into astrology.
Yeah, well, I'm super excited to hear what you have to say. So why don't you just start us out? The
Sure.
multipolar zodiac. What
Yes.
what do you mean by that, and why do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, well, I guess mainly it's well, here, I'll start from the beginning.
Yeah,
you have like a little bit that I'll
yeah,
be structured, and then it'll get a little more free flowing. But
awesome.
The traditional construction of gender and sexuality within astrology really does mirror the way that gender and sexuality has been framed in Western society for the most part, throughout most of recorded history, really. And you get two genders, right? Two sexes, masculine male and feminine female. That's sort of the traditional presentation of gender. And it's interesting because, like, the more you read, especially within like traditional texts, you get a weird sort of kind of blanket categorization of planets and signs into sort of gender categories. But then when they actually talk about it, it's a lot more nuanced, but it's almost like, I don't know, it sort of mirrors the way that I imagine society tended to perceive gender in terms of like, this is male, this is female. But we'll get into it. But so most of us are familiar with astrology. most of us who are familiar with astrology learned that fire and air signs are masculine, and water and earth signs are feminine, right? Sure, you were
yes,
introduced to astrology that way.
Yes.
Yeah, and I usually prefer to frame it in terms of, I guess, diurnal, nocturnal. We're kind of talking about the concept of polarity, and like just the term polarity suggests, a kind of a set of opposites, which, we like to kind of neatly frame things that way. We kind of tend to want to frame masculine and feminine in terms of opposites, but might be a lot more overlap there. But the signs divided into masculine and feminine. Planets have also been divided along the lines of gender as well, with Mars, the Sun, Jupiter, and by most historical authors, Saturn, though it's kind of a source of debate, even kind of in the historical literature, being identified as masculine, intending to signify male figures. However, we get Venus and the Moon being considered feminine and signifying female figures, while Mercury was said to change genders depending on various conditions, such as its sign, its relationship with the sun, and various other factors. There's a lot of ways that astrologers historically augmented maybe the gender expression of a planet, depending on a lot of different factors, the phase and relationship to the sun and everything. But we're not going to go into all of it because it's a lot. But you may notice the imbalance in the system with you got your 4 masculine planets to your 2 feminine planets, and really kind of consider that your first clue that the system of astrology is brilliant and useful as it is. It was devised by men whose worldview was this fundamentally like patriarchal as the societies that they lived in.
Yep.
So, definitely there's kind of a need to maybe reframe things or to update maybe to the degree that you want to use this. So to the degree that you want to really gender planets and signs, because for me personally, as an astrologer in my practice, I don't sort of default do that. It's useful when it's useful. It's useful when clients are dealing with specifically issues around gender specifically. And it certainly shows up, but there's a lot more, I guess, to planets and signs than their gender. And I find personally that sometimes categorizing things that way can sort of gloss over a lot of the more nuanced qualities. But yeah, also worth noting in this discussion, I'm not, we can probably talk about it a little bit, but for purposes of this presentation, I'm not including the outer planets in this just because Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto they're not important or relevant to the topic, but because their discovery and introduction to astrology was so recent in relative terms, incorporating them into this framework, it's still kind of being worked out, I think, and is really a subject worthy of its own discussion. But maybe if we have time, we can explore it. But my goal really is just to kind of get under the hood a bit, to identify a little more precisely what it is we're assigning gender to in astrology, and demonstrate how astrology might offer us a bit more nuanced, fluid, and multidimensional way of understanding the topic of gender and sexuality.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, my long-winded introduction, but we'll start with polarity. And like we talking about a little bit already, this idea of polarity is this sort of division of the signs and even the planets along the lines of feminine and masculine, or nocturnal and diurnal. So, your water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, and your earth signs, Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, are generally considered feminine planet signs. And then you get the moon, Venus, and Mars as nocturnal planets, but Mars, and likewise with Saturn, Mars is actually a very almost like hyper-masculine kind of planet. And the reason that it belongs to the nocturnal sect is because, or the nocturnal end of things, is because the coolness and sort of moisture of the nighttime offsets sort of excessive heat and dryness of Mars. Makes it more productive and a little less of a challenging planet at nighttime.
Are you wanting to share your screen?
Oh, I'm not sharing my screen, am I?
It's like, I think you have visuals that go with what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm looking at my visuals, but yeah. My bad. All right, here we are. Thank you for reminding me.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so this is kind of our traditional conception of the genderizing of signs and planets. Get Mars, which is traditionally a monolithic planet. In its nature, it sort of needs to be augmented or offset, to be countered a little bit to get sort of the best qualities of Mars to be expressed.
So, sorry, I'm confused. So are you saying that, because I'm trained more in the evolutionary astrology, so I don't learn, anyway, this is a little bit new to me. So are you saying traditionally Mars is diurnal, and you're giving a revisionist version where it's actually nocturnal?
Okay. Well, so in traditional texts, Mars was assigned to the nocturnal, they called it a sect, the nocturnal sect. And the sects sort of are divided along these sort of gender lines. But with Mars and Saturn, because they're traditionally considered malefic planets, their nature needs to be augmented or offset. So while Mars is probably more of a diurnal kind of planet, has more of a nature that is diurnal, that is, of the daytime, hot, a little hotter, a little drier.
Right.
It's more in line with that, but it's too much of that. So it needs to be offset by being in the nighttime, or ideally it's offset by having.
And so that need to be offset, is that still part of the traditional framework? Yeah. Okay. So you're not naming anything that you would reframe yet. Like you're still just talking. Okay, got it.
Yeah, we're talking strictly about the sort of baseline tradition that goes back thousands of years. The further we get along, the more you get sort of different ideas about it. And then I'll be sort of inserting some of my my personal interpretations, which are not my own entirely. There are other, astrologers historically that went this way on things too. There's still a lot that's kind of open to interpretation, but this is sort of the fundamental structure.
Cool. Got it.
Yeah, and then you get, your diurnal fire, air signs, with the sun, Jupiter being your masculine planets, right? And Saturn, though traditionally by most historical astrologers was lumped into they considered Saturn masculine. There were a handful that considered Saturn feminine. We'll get into it. I am going to treat Saturn as kind of like Mercury, as being sort of a gender neutral planet, for reasons that we'll get into as we get into sort of the fine tuning of why are these water and earth signs considered feminine, and why are the fire and air signs considered masculine? Like what's the sort of logic behind that? Yeah, questions or thoughts or anything?
No, keep going. It's great.
Yeah. So we got to talk a bit about the basic natures. which has to do, it's sort of tied into this system of temperament that was constructed kind of along with the Greek tradition of astrology and got more developed through the medieval era. But really we're talking about the qualities of the signs. We have 4 sort of basic qualities, the signs and the planets. We get dryness versus wetness, and heat versus cold. And I guess when we're thinking about like polarity, for me, I just tend to want to look at it as having these sort of 2 poles because, while we like neat binaries, I think the human mind likes to organize things in this nice, neat way, but we really kind of have a more than one pole, I think, going on that maybe needs more attention because, again, there's maybe a tendency to gloss over some of the qualities of the signs by just saying, oh, well, that's feminine and this is masculine. But basically you have dry, which is the essence of dryness is separating. It's, individuating. It's very organized. It's good at like, in contrast to wetness, really. Wetness signifies the connection of things. Moisture binds and holds things together, while dryness creates separation. You think of like a cookie, if it's too dry, it'll sort of crumble and fall apart.
Right.
But it also will sort of bring things down to their basic essence, because there's that, that separative quality allows you to sort of organize things. And it's conducive to, in a person, logic, sort of rationality, because you're able to distinguish between things. And when we think about wetness, moisture, water, think about emotion, so it's sort of the opposite of emotional. It's sort of leaving emotion out of things and having this sort of clear, cut and dry way of looking at things or approaching things. It tends to be very decisive as well, because there's nothing really kind of holding things together. There's nothing that they have to pull apart. It's already kind of pulled apart, so it's just like decisive.
It's easy to go one way or another.
Yeah. But sort of on the negative end, it's rather antisocial. It's not really interested in connecting or connection. Can be rather abrasive. It's also, dryness, it's not conducive to life. It's not really life affirming, this idea of dryness. While it has a role, too much dryness obviously is, what a desert. It's can't really live there. Really excessively dry people can be kind of rigid, and maybe there can be a tendency to be overly controlling, because of because it's not easy. I don't know. It's really looking at it in terms of like contrasting it with wetness, which is flowing and adaptive. Conforms to whatever shape is sort of presented to it. While dryness is like that, the opposing principle.
Like I think when you're talking about the dryness, I keep thinking of Aquarius. Would Aquarius be more of a dry archetype, or?
That's an interesting point. Well, because I should probably talk about this a little bit. So fire, its basic nature is to be hot and dry. Air's basic nature is to be hot or warm. You can say, just say hot. It's on the hot end of the spectrum, and wet or moist.
Oh, interesting.
But well, when you fine tune it a little bit, we'll get there. Okay. Aquarius is its own kind of animal a little bit. While Earth is cold and dry, and water is cold and wet. Yeah, so I mean, wetness, it's adaptive, accommodating, responsive, all that good stuff. It's not as precise. It's kind of lacks distinction. It sort of blends and smooths things together, and which can be useful, but too much of that can make things kind of hard to distinguish, fuzzy, illogical maybe, and smothering potentially, sort of stifling, like too much. And it's also has weight. Water and earth have weight. They bring things down, which gets us into the cold end of things, which, the nature of coldness is to consolidate and sort of bring things down, while heat rises, lifts things up and separates to some degree. It sort of it expands. So, but it also kind of thins out a little bit, while coldness will consolidate and harden. But also cold has like this pacifying quality, it's kind of soothing. It's associated with introversion, being more inwardly focused. But it's conducive to like concentration, and making things solid and hard. On the negative end, it's can be kind of negating, it's a little bit on like it'll say no to something and it slows things down, which has obvious utility, but too much. It's associated with like depression or sort of apathy, just sort of like lower energy, not able to get things going. While heat is kind of the opposite. It's invigorating, expanding. It purifies things. You think when you burn something, you're sort of transmuting it and sort of reducing it to its essence, in a sense. I mean, you think of you're destroying it potentially, but you're turning it into something else. Often carbon, I guess. But you think of like metal, when you burn or heat metal, it eliminates all the impurities, and what you get is like a pure alloy.
Right.
It's associated with extroversion, taking action. On the negative end, destruction, anger, forcefulness, and violence. Does that make sense?
Yep, it does.
So it gets a little weird when you're trying to identify even just the justification for why certain signs were considered masculine and certain signs were considered feminine, or certain planets. Claudius Ptolemy, who's one of the early sort of Greek authors around the 2nd century, he basically said that he even actually sort of acknowledged that there was multiple ways that they sort of arrived at this. I think one of the original ones was just the numerology of the signs. If you start with Aries, you get 1, which is an odd number. So the odd numbers are masculine and the even numbers are feminine. I don't know why, personally, why that, why that's the case. Maybe because 1 looks rather phallic, or it just has to do with like independence. Not sure, but Ptolemy basically said that he thought that has to do with wetness versus dryness. That males and masculinity is dry, and females' femininity is wetness. It's moisture. It's nurturing and soothing and nutritive, right? But there's weight to water, so heavy. Get there, staying organized. But yeah, as we talked about, water is cold and wet, earth is cold and dry, fire is hot and dry, air is warm and moist. And when you think about it, there's lots of ways that I guess I can understand the logic behind making these two signs, the fire and air masculine and earth and water feminine, is that you have this sort of social hierarchy component to it, where the fire and air signs, because they're warm, they rise up, they're above, and they're out in the public social sphere, and they're in more of a position of authority. It's one of the things that heat will tend to signify is it's rises, one above others. So increasing in rank, while the coldness slows things down and makes make the domestic sphere, keeps you sort of at home,
closer to the earth.
Yeah, closer to the earth, for sure. Yeah, and we'll get into it. I have a harder and harder time framing, maybe a lot of the traditional conceptions of masculinity and femininity along the lines of temperature, lines of heat versus cold. I guess the wetness and the dryness seems like the most obvious contrast to me, I guess, or maybe where it's more consistent with a lot of our traditional conceptions around gender. But what I guess I tend to think of, or maybe what you really end up getting, is something more like this, maybe when you're talking about gender, where you get water sort of representing that sort of the maybe pure feminine energy, or that really traditional domesticated emotional connection, socially oriented and conforming, accommodating kind of energy that has been sort of assigned to women historically, while fire is that really active, decisive, energized, authoritative, traditionally masculine kind of energy, I guess. Again, it's hard for me to like, is it though? Because Earth is very dry as well, so, or leans dry, and it may just be because my dad had a massive Capricorn stellium, but I guess I just associate a lot of like male figures with, or maybe the idea of masculinity having more to do with that cold, dry quality of Earth, where it's solid and dependable and reliable, but also kind of not sentimental, kind of very firm with boundaries and stuff. I don't know. That's
practical.
Yeah. And I think the deeper we get into it, it'll sort of start to make sense that it gets harder and harder to really categorize things this way. But we'll get into maybe the planets a little bit. This is probably not where the planets tend to actually fall on this grid, but just for sake of contrasting them with each other, this might look a little bit like this. You get your masculine diurnal planets, right? Jupiter, the Sun, and Mars up here in this fiery end of the spectrum. Jupiter has, its nature is to be kind of warming and moistening to some degree. But if you're contrasting it with Venus, which is, also has the capacity to warm things, but is a little more on the cooling, soothing side, softening things, and tends to be wetter, signify wetness, more than Jupiter. You sort of get the two traditional benefics sort of in this Goldilocks zone, kind of in the middle, where their job is to balance things, to stabilize and affirm things, but sort of operating kind of on this different, not different, but in a more balanced way, I guess. Neither one of them is excessively hot or cold or dry.
So theoretically, neither of them would send an energy into an extreme. Theoretically, Jupiter, I guess, could, well, anything could, but in this conception, they're not as likely as Mars or Saturn.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess it's really, well, we're talking about like the basic nature, maybe, of the planet. So many different factors will influence the way that the planets will express, or will kind of steer them maybe a little hotter, a little colder, a little drier, which ends up being very descriptive of people's experience say you get Venus in a sign like Aries, right? That's very dry. It's fire. So you have to sort of deal with dryness and heat, the things that signifies. And your Venus, you're trying to make connections. You're trying to hold things together and stabilize. And you're sort of dealing with kind of unstable material, which can show up for people in a lot of ways.
My Venus is in Aries.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's where you get the, it won't always show up as specifically, gendered topics for people, but, it often will when you get a planet, specifically maybe more, we'll say like heavily gendered planet, in a sign that is sort of testing maybe its nature a little bit. He will get that sort of like feeling out of place maybe in the way that you express, your gender, if you will. Yeah, well, Jupiter, they say it's kind of masculine. Jupiter is kind of, it's a little more in the middle. I guess I find you don't get like the topic as much. So we'll get in there as we get more nuanced and detailed with. There's so many layers to this that we'll get into.
Yes.
Yeah, but the sun, it's hot and dry, but maybe not excessively so. It's warming and invigorating. It's maybe more of that essence of heat and dryness that we like, that we want. While the moon is a little more cool, wet, it's emotional. It signifies caregivers and, our internal sort of private world, even like the body, traditionally, where, what is like the you that is condensed and consolidated in physical form? It's your body. And that's kind of the moon. Saturn gets interesting because while there's no real dispute over its coldness, Saturn is associated with being excessively cold, drawing things down, negating, slowing things, heaviness, depression, right? Its nature can be augmented in many ways, but thing that I always think about is, while I guess most sources will say that Saturn is dry, and I'll tend to lean that way. In traditional texts, you always get stuff about wetness, and you even get Capricorn, which is signified by the sea goat, and Aquarius, the water bearer.
Right.
So I don't know what it is with Saturn and water, but for our purposes, we can just assume that Saturn is excessively cold and Mars is excessively hot and dry. Again, too much heat and dryness will separate, sever, burn, destroy if it's too much. But if you temper Mars a little bit, it's a little more of that, invigorating, prompting action, yeah, I feel like I've been talking for a long time. So any thoughts or questions or
No, I will jump in as I want to, I promise.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, Mercury is super interesting. I actually can't wait to my friend Joji, who I believe has already done their talk.
Yeah.
At this point, talking about Mercury, and Mercury is it's really hard to label or fit Mercury into a category because its nature is to adapt to its circumstances. So, and also change. So it can be, it'll dry things if they need to be dried, or it'll moisten. It'll kind of do everything depending on the conditions in the chart, or, what's being indicated for Mercury. But it's hard to really pin down what Mercury's doing, or at least fit it into this nice, neat kind of my mouth's getting dry.
Yeah, his talk on Mercury is awesome, by the way.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear it. But probably most authors would say that Mercury leans dry, dry and cold, because you sort of need that for what Mercury is good at. It's, organizing, defining things, creating, it's communication, right? And to categorize things into words, to create symbols, you need a bit of dryness and a bit of coldness to define things and consolidate ideas into something you can communicate, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's probably more I wanted to say on that, but we'll get going. This, I think I meant to take that one out. I wanted to actually get to this because one of the ways that I guess I tend to think about the idea of like masculinity and femininity is these sort of zip files that we sort of stick a bunch of different qualities and ideas and topics into this sort of zip file. And I think what you do with a zip file is like you transfer it, you sort of send it around, and it signifies stuff that you assume to be in that zip file. But sometimes, if you're just using the term like masculine to describe something, you're probably describing a broad, maybe you're trying to describe something specific, but you're describing a sort of a broad base of ideas and topics and qualities.
It's right? Like a broad brush as opposed to a thin brush. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and some of those you may not mean to put in there, or you may not mean to include, but you also, and this is like the issue that I ran into, I had to ask people around, I had to ask people I know for, give me some words that like you think of. Mm-hmm. So, I got like, for masculinity, right? You get practical, aggressive, active, decisive, assertive, strong, right? Extroverted, I was a little ambivalent about.
These are kind of like the stereotypes we think of when we associate qualities. Okay.
Or at least these are the ones that I arrived at. I'm wondering, you might arrive at different ones. I guess I would ask what are some of what do you think are some of the qualities that are in your masculine zip file?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking you, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, again, I have my Venus is in Aries, so in my 8th house, if that tells you anything. So like I think of the feminine also as including a lot of power. I mean, different types of power and then this is what I'm still sitting with personally, is what does this all mean? And of course, I think part of the point of what you and I have talked about and what this whole symposium is about is at this time in humanity's history, this is all getting reshuffled, and the categories are kind of blending, and so I don't really know my answer, honestly. Yeah.
Good answer. No, it's this is actually kind of like a struggle for me, because I was I don't know, I think maybe it's a good exercise to do, is to sort of maybe unzip your personal zip file when it comes to what comes to mind when you hear the word masculine, what comes to mind when you hear the word feminine, and unpacking that and like seeing what's actually there, because when I was doing this, it's like, I was trying to separate my own thoughts about what I tend to associate with masculine and feminine, but a lot of that's like stuff I saw on TV, or stuff that and there's a lot of contradiction sort of within that. And I think for these purposes, I tried to find stuff that maybe most people would agree on, or is maybe part of the dominant maybe lexicon, or the
I mean, these seem definitely in line with patriarchal conditioning for sure.
That it's more or less kind of what you get, and we sort of code these things in these terms. But then when you maybe apply them, and this is not going to be perfect either, but you try applying them to the elements, right? Water, earth, air, and fire, and the sort of qualities that they signify. What you get is, water signifying mainly, things that we would conceptualize as feminine. I actually had a harder time finding things that I could fit into the traditional masculine kind of framework. With fire, the only one I could think of was dramatic, right? It's fire, which is hot and dry. It tends to be, it's very showy, and they're both kind of like emotional and sort of like I think the water tends to get associated with that sort of like emo kind of whiny crybaby quality, but fire is going to be more likely to express its feelings than water will inherently, because it's inherently kind of colder. It tends to keep things more inside, or share them, only be more deliberate in who it shares the water with, right?
And one thing I'm just thinking about in terms of fire is there is a relational quality with fire, right? Like I think of, I mean, there's a connective drive, like with Mars or Aries. I mean, in the sense of like it wants to penetrate, so it wants to connect in a certain sense.
Yeah, the thing with fire, or at least pure fire, which the signs all have, so we'll get into their own sort of. None of them are perfectly fire, right? Like they're all sort of augmented by different factors that we'll explore a little bit. But one of the things that I like to do in my practice is I work with like temperament a lot, and there's like ways of sort of assessing the overall temperament of the chart. And fire is associated with choleric, right? It's that sort of aggressive, impulsive, kind of authoritative, decisive kind of personality. They do tend to be in positions of authority. You'll find a lot of authority figures with the sort of choleric temperament, that fiery temperament, because it's social in the sense of it wanting to achieve, right? It has this kind of relationship with like duty and like the right thing to do, in terms of kind of, it can be a little more black and white in its thinking. But it's not necessarily connectively social. Like it's, we'll look at a person and sort of assess them and be like, how can I use you for this?
Right. It's not what is particularly empathetic.
No. Yeah. It's hot and dry. Yeah. It's, but then you're not going to find a ton of people who are just all fire or all hotness and dryness. Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't want to hang out with that person. I mean, they all have like their excess nature, all the signs do.
Right.
But as I was getting into Earth, I found a lot more of a bleeding of, I guess what you maybe call like gendered qualities or gendered topics. That sort of coding that we have for gender. It's when you get to Earth and air, it's very like, hard to distinguish. 'Cause Earth, it's kind of conforming, it's attractive, right? It's has gravity, has weight, so it kind of draws in. It's sort of passive in the sense that it's you have to come to Earth, right? It's like Earth does have, different signs have capacity to move things. If you have a lot of Earth, you do move. You're not an inert object. But Earth is also supportive, right? It's just things that we associate with mothers, maybe, or the feminine principle. But Earth is also very logical. It's very practical, and it tends to be more independent because it has that dry nature. It's less interested in relationships. It's less somebody who's like very, very, very excessively Earth, probably tends to be kind of a loner, or is a little more interested in just the practical approach to things.
I never thought about that, but you're right. Like Taurus is more of an
Taurus has that energy,
and even Virgo and Capricorn, all of them.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
not necessarily not wanting to merge like Scorpio or right. Got it.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah. Taurus, I would we'll get into why a little bit, but Taurus is probably a little warmer and a little more moist than the other earth signs. At least a little wetter. You know, it's ruled by Venus.
Yeah.
And it's because of where it is kind of in the zodiac, it has a little more of that moist quality, but it's still, you know, most Tauruses are happy to do their own thing. Speaking as a Taurus myself, I have 3 planets in Taurus. I do relate and, you know, appreciate company of others, but I'm perfectly happy to do my own thing a lot of the time.
Yeah. I have my Pluto and my North Node in my second house. And anyway, I have lots of so my Jupiter in Taurus. And yes, I need actually a lot of space, a lot of time alone. But I also have a lot of Aries stuff. So anyway.
Yeah, which is very independent. And that's sort of the thing that Earth and Fire share, is that sort of that independent streak and that sort of dry, while Earth is not as maybe decisive as it's more methodical, right? It will carefully consider what it's doing because it's cold, so it's slower and more considered. While fire it's impulsive, you know, it'll feel more confident about its decisions, even if they're wrong. But it'll just make those decisions, you know, it'll do it, which you need to do sometimes. Earth will deliberate for a long time, but it's probably more likely to get things right the first time as well, because it takes its time with stuff. Both have their merits, right? But air and water, they're the 2 wet elements. So they deal more with emotional intelligence, empathy, socializing, but their difference is in maybe the heat, right? If air is, like if you boil water, you get steam, you know, you get gas, you get air in a sense. So while air is, you know, it'll be more extroverted, more outgoing, more assertive, because, you know, has that heat, invigorated, that confidence that gets associated with heat. It's a little more, you know, it's also sort of like freedom loving, which maybe you associate with men. Men love their independence, right?
And sometimes and sometimes any gender. Yes, but yes.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it was funny, like doing this. It was like, I think my goal was to sort of go through the motions of, let's, you know, gender, you know, let's do this as far as we can, you know, let's put everything into this very narrow sort of one-dimensional spectrum. Hopefully so that we can kind of see how riddled with contradiction and how not easy it is to use. It's kind of a clunky tool to the sort of, you know, masculine, feminine hammer. It's a very like blunt sort of instrument. You get air and water both having much more to do with socializing, a little more of that nurturing, that, you know, giving a shit about how other people feel is going to be or what their thoughts are. That's going to be more of your air and your water. So I mean, it could be up for grabs, you know, to what degree you might want to try to codify air or even really water. Let's move on a little bit. So I want to try to get, for the purposes of getting as precise as we can with this sort of blunt instrument, we're going to go into some of the ways that we're going to kind of look at the planets and the way that they're sort of genderized in different sort of layers. So one of the ways that you can look at the planets, and they're not limited to these ages, you know, they can be active at different times of your life. They signify different things, right? But sort of archetypal essence of the planets, which will kind of describe a lot about their sort of nature and quality. Is that Mercury has this sort of nature of childhood, sort of prepubescence, where it's just sort of like it's not, you know, they're like they're light, you know, they're not super serious and focused, except when you have maybe the Virgo side of Mercury, right? Which is more serious and more focused. Yeah, it's even traditionally they make references to Mercury, and it's associated with children and usually boys specifically, because everybody, you know, you only really saw men, I think, are males in society, in traditional Greek society, but
yeah.
But Mercury, it sort of describes that energy of childhood a little bit, where you're sort of interested in stuff, you're learning things, you're gathering information, but you're not like super serious about any one thing as much. Some kids are, because, you know, kids aren't all one thing, but you get kind of that energy. And also before you hit puberty, your sexual identity isn't really fully developed yet. Even physically, you know, you're not super gendered at that point, or, you know, your sexual expression is not fully matured. Though society will tend to, or, you know, we enculturate children we tend to identify as one gender or the other.
Right.
You know, you wear dresses, you wear pants, you know, this, which to varying degrees applies still, but in Mercury's nature is to just receive the information and be like, oh, okay, you know, I do that. But then when people get older, it's like their sexual identity evolves, and that's when you sort of get teenage and early adulthood, maybe where that identity matters the most in a sense. It's when you're trying to attract, you know, partners. You're very interested in sex usually. You're very kind of full of the sort of desire that Mars and Venus sort of signify. I think of like jocks, I guess, sometimes with Mars, even the sun to some degree, that sort of like that blustery macho sort of energy. And Venus is, you know, wants to look beautiful and sort of attract everyone, but it's also very social. Venus is like a very social planet, which, you know, keeps it from being super, I don't know, if you're using this sort of cold, wet association for that blanket feminine, Venus has a little more heat, a little more warmth. It's a little more outgoing and extroverted, depending on Venus. But when you're talking about its basic nature, but the sun and the moon are probably more of like your full adulthood, like 30, 45. I don't know what else to call it other than full adulthood, but that sort of, you know, your archetypal sort of parent age, right? You know, the sun's kind of like your blanket sort of dad energy, and it's traditionally one of the significators for fathers, and the moon, likewise, one of the traditional significators for mothers. I don't find that it always shows up quite that cleanly in practice, which doesn't surprise me, but you could sort of think of them as the sort of masculine, feminine archetypes of those two, that sort of age group. Jupiter, while it's not limited to this age, Jupiter has this the quality of like being wise and having sort of collected a lot of information, and also being in a position to be a benefit to other people. So usually around that age, you know, that 45 to 59, that kind of is just an arbitrary number.
But you know what's fascinating to me about you labeling it that way, and this would not apply to every person who turns 45, but I just turned 45.
Oh yeah.
On March 5th of this year, and on my birthday, the sun was conjunct Jupiter on my sun, and the north node of the moon was to the minute conjunct my natal Jupiter, and my sun is in Pisces, right? So traditionally ruled by Jupiter. Anyway, so it was this like crazy configuration, and then last night, we're recording this on May 16th, 2022, right? So last night there was this total lunar eclipse on opposite my Jupiter. So anyway, this ushering for me personally, again, this would not apply to every person turning 45 at all, but it happens to be that for me, this whole becoming 45 is like mega Jupiterian.
Wow.
I don't know. So it's interesting to me that, anyway, that's
well, and look at you, you're running the symposium where you're bringing people together in like sort of a large group.
Exactly.
Very Jupiterian. Yeah,
very it's really fascinating. Yeah,
but wow, it's already, can't believe I've been talking for this long. Jesus. Sorry. Try to speed it up a little bit, but yeah, basically the point that I'm making here with all this is that the older you get, your gender expression kind of goes down, even like your sexual hormones. Physiologically, you produce less of them the older you get. And especially, for women, like around the postmenopausal era age, but men as well, like the physical body, just that men and women just start to become more like each other. Again, kind of like in childhood. So it's one of the reasons that I, in practice, treat Mercury and Saturn as sort of signifying. I would probably treat them differently. And Mercury, I tend to think of as being both genders, or being kind of everything, or a jack of all trades, or fluid, very fluid, while Saturn is sort of neither. It's not really gendered in the sense, or like doesn't necessarily matter to Saturn.
Sort of neutral, as opposed to Mercury being all inclusive.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Mercury, I feel like, essentially will flow between both. Granted, they all sort of will, but Mercury is definitely, of the planets, it will move the most on this sort of 2D spectrum that we have of the sort of hot, cold, wet, dry sort of spectrum. Yeah. So let's see. All right, so it's a little fun activity that I did because I like visual metaphors. So if we really want to just take this gender thing and run with it and get as precise as we can with this one-dimensional spectrum, we can start kind of like this. Maybe the traditional polarity. We get your earth and water signs, and we call them masculine, and the red ones, the air and fire signs, are masculine, and the earth and water, they're feminine, right? There's some, arguments that make the argument. There's certain systems that will sort of approach it like this, that cardinal, being movable, being initiating, and action-oriented, is more masculine, fixed being more feminine, because of that sort of the fixed is not inherently passive, but it has that, it's receiving what it was given by the cardinal sign and sort of carrying things. I'm only going to rank this, not emphasizing this one too much, but then you get mutability or double-bodied signs, which, they're adaptable, but they're of two natures. It's an interesting dynamic with all the signs. They have like kind of a dynamic expression that's very, Sagittarius, you get your philosophical sort of contemplative person, but you also get your party animal as well.
And of course, two of those mutable signs are ruled by Mercury.
Yeah, exactly. If we go by element, which is, I'm basically adding, layers to it. So if we go with the polarity, let's rock with that as one of the layers that we'll add here. But digging a little deeper, if you really want to divide things along masculine, feminine terms, you get Earth as being, maybe a little bit more on the blue end, but it's kind of purple. Likewise with air, it's a little more on the red end, but it's, still kind of purple. And then you get your water and fire, which are maybe a little more of that solid, easier to gender if you want to. And if you go by your traditional rulership, you get the moon, which is, probably the most archetypally feminine planet in astrology. while Mars is probably the easiest to archetypally just put in that pure masculine energy, or just it's very fire. It's very hot and dry, and it's over the top a little bit. So it's all the way red. While the sun is more or less mostly red, Venus is rather purple, but probably leaning towards the blue side. Jupiter is rather red, but leaning kind of purpley. It's in the temperament, the temperament model. You get Jupiter's sanguine. So even though it doesn't rule any air signs, sanguine is associated with air. So it's hot and wet. While Venus and the moon are phlegmatic. They're sort of categorized as wet and cool, cold, to varying degrees, right? But so run them with it. Even you can throw in the exaltations a little bit. So Capricorn gets maybe a little bit of that masculine energy from it being the exaltation of Mars. You get a little bit of the nature of Venus with Pisces, a little bit of the nature of the sun with Aries, the moon with Taurus, and Jupiter with Cancer. Then you even get seasons. We're given this sort of temperament to them, where you get Aries, Taurus, Gemini being associated with spring. They're wet and hot. Cancer, Leo, Virgo, hot and dry. Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, cool and dry, right? Yeah. And then Pisces, Aquarius, and Capricorn of the winter, which is wet and cold. So you can even gender it that way if you want to. And what you come out with is this rather more nuanced sort of look at the signs along this one-dimensional spectrum, which applies to the degree that it applies, because we live in a world where we do still, to some degree, have these kind of vague archetypes or these vague sort of set of expectations on people's behavior around ideas of masculinity and femininity. It's one way that I like to look at a planet in a sign. When a planet is in a sign, it has certain expectations of it that it needs to meet. And different planets will have varying degrees of comfortability meeting those expectations. But even this doesn't really capture the essence, because Libra and Scorpio, they look a lot alike, right? But they're two very different signs. Scorpio really probably gets both extremes, where it's a very wet, cool kind of sign, but it's ruled traditionally by Mars, which makes it rather hot. And it has like this sort of extreme dichotomy within it, which tells you a lot about Scorpio, right?
Very intensely relational.
Intensely, yeah. Well, it's how does Mars do water? How does Mars do that cool water? Does it in a sort of aggressive way? It's that is the end of my slides, and I realize I've been talking for a very long time, which I didn't plan to do. I planned to have a lot more dialogue involved here.
No.
But I guess the sort of takeaways that we maybe already sort of touched on is how useful is this? Like, how useful is it to frame astrology this way, and even like frame our characters and our personalities and our ways of expressing ourselves this way? I find personally, especially when I was younger, like the expectations maybe that I felt that I needed to be held accountable to, given the sexual identity that I was born with, but also my personal identification, which happened to align, but in more nuanced ways didn't really. I have a lot of earth and a lot of water, like a bit of air as well. not much fire, actually no
Mhm.
fire whatsoever,
Hmm.
sadly. But it's I know it was like a source for me, maybe of it was a sore spot, maybe of not measuring up to certain what I perceive to be like masculine archetypes. This, decisive kind of macho, aggressive kind of energy. Having that sort of expectation, but not meeting it, hurt my feelings, which I
Right.
have, or made me feel insecure, made me feel uh, not okay with who I was, right? And I think that while gender is obviously like very important to people and their identity within it is very important, I guess maybe looking at things. Well, here's the thing with this is that it shows you maybe how things look. Have you ever heard of the book Flatland?
No.
Oh, it's a great book. It's actually about it's like written in like the late 1800s, and it was all the characters and everybody lived in a one-dimensional world, and
Oh,
the
wow.
society was stratified based on how many angles you had. So like all the women were lines because it was patriarchal, of course, and the males were all varying degrees of polygons. So
Hmm.
if you were a triangle, you were very low. If you were square, you were a little bit higher. If you were, basically the highest you could get was something approaching a circle, which means you have like just many, 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 many sides.
Wow.
But anyway, that was total aside. But it doesn't tell you much about what the actual experience of say having planets in Scorpio is. You're not dealing with this sort of gender, maybe middle ground neutral. You're dealing with maybe both extremes, but you're also dealing with a lot of other qualities that maybe have nothing to do with gender, right? Or don't have to. Maybe we lump things into these categories that we don't need to. So I guess my goal wasn't necessarily to define it for everybody, but maybe offering a different angle, different way of looking at it.
Right.
That maybe gives it more of a sense of what it is.
Mm. And all the shades, literally the shades involved.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I had a whole another way of structuring it where I had different colors that were, but I was like, this is too much. Make my brain explode.
Yeah. Well, very cool. And so when let's say you're looking at a chart, or even you're maybe not even thinking astrology, you're just interacting with a human. I mean, could you kind of sum it up or give an example or something of what feels the best to you? What feels the best, or maybe even thinking about yourself. I don't know. You pick. What feels like the best approach to thinking about, let's say, who you are, like you have certain qualities that are traditionally quote unquote one gender or another or both. But what feels better to you? What's the best way for you to think about it?
Well, like I said, like doing this, I was surprised almost to the degree that I don't think about things in that paradigm. While I know that I have like the calculation going on, sort of, that we all sort of have that that programming. It's one of the first things that we identify as very young children is the identifying between genders, right? Like that's
Even
a boy, that's a girl.
The gender reveal parties that people
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But to me, and when I talk about it, I just call, if I'm trying to describe something or describe the quality of a person, I don't just really think about it or describe somebody as, oh, this person's, kind of extroverted. They're very charismatic and, they're decisive and maybe a little pushy. I guess I use those words and I don't lump them into masculine. I guess I don't think of that as specifically masculine. That could be a woman that's behaving that way. And in fact, probably most of the women in my life, I could assign a lot of those qualities to because, yeah. And likewise, if somebody's more introverted or quiet and emotional and relationship oriented and, considerate and cares about, how the people around them are doing, I don't think of that person as feminine, I just think of those qualities, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah.
And I guess that feels good.
No, you go ahead. What?
That's what feels best to me, I guess. It's just using, you know, instead of using maybe the zip file, using the qualities of the person or the topic.
Right. Like more of the nuanced brushes as opposed to the humongous broad stroke, this or that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's making me think of about a year and a half ago, I was interacting with this male person who I guess you could consider like quote unquote traditionally very masculine and whatever, very like extreme. And at one point I asked him, I was just curious, like his perception of me, because I was sitting with all these questions around what is gender, what is quote unquote masculine, what is quote unquote feminine. And I have like my Venus in Aries, so I have a lot of qualities that could be considered quote unquote masculine. And so I asked this person at one point, when you think of me, do you like if there's a gender spectrum, or where would you say I fall in, like masculine versus feminine, or somewhere in between, or not, you know, something else? And his reaction was, oh, you're like one of the most feminine people I've ever met in my whole entire life. And I still don't know what he meant. Like I still don't understand what that was. And I don't necessarily care. I just find it really interesting, like that. I'm curious what that meant. Yeah. And he is, you know, a very extreme version of a human. So it might be just his own skewed perception. But anyway, it's just interesting.
Yeah. Well, and it just sort of goes to show you like that, like what was he talking about? Like which quality about you, you know, which thing was it that he identified as masculine or feminine? Like,
right. I don't know. I mean, I'm going to guess that I do tend to be very, in a certain mode, I tend to be very open, empathetic, receptive, all of that stuff. And he probably didn't see the sides of me that were more like, you know, charging into battle, gonna, you know, like go and do investigation of child abuse and, you know, remove children from their home. Like there's another side to me that's very decisive and clear and all of that. But you could also consider that a mama bear. Like that's me being protective as quote unquote the feminine. You know, what's feminine, what's masculine in that? I don't know. Does it matter? I don't know.
Well, that's, I think, really at the essence of it is like we all have all the planets, right? I've read a lot of charts and they all have Mars in them and they all have Venus in them. Right. But there's different ways of doing Venus, and and it's even something maybe to think about with like the dignity system. While it's relevant because society's expectations of those things they're still rooted in that kind of traditional framework. While I love that I see more and more that like men are being held to the expectation that they're supposed to be considerate and, you know, concerned about how other people are doing and, you know, not super aggressive and, you know, pushing people around and bossing people around. Like it's less, I don't know if I want to say it's less of an expectation, but there's other versions, maybe other constructs of masculinity that are available.
Right.
Which, you know, we can use if we need to, but I guess when I think about it for myself, I guess I try to hold everybody to sort of the same standards that have to do with my personal values, you know, my conception of what I think, you know, makes a good, solid person, which, you know, there's not one version of that, but there's multiple versions, but really probably it has to do with balance, you know, not going to the extremes of maybe any of the different temperaments or something, you know, it's having a little bit of water, having a little bit of air, a little bit of dryness, a little bit of coldness.
Yeah.
And, we all express those different qualities in different areas of our lives too. So I would, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who's fits any one of the many different models for gender that maybe are available.
Well, and the image that's coming to me now, maybe one way, I don't know, to sum this up is like, it's almost like we are each an ecosystem of some kind. And so it's almost like it doesn't matter maybe what exact ratio we have of the elements, but so long as for us, that ratio is supporting life, like if you have a little, do you understand what I'm trying to say? If you have a little ecosystem that is that's supporting certain plant life or animal life or whatever, and it's there you disappeared for a second. Here you go. You came back. Here you are.
That could be my internet.
No. Cool. I was just saying that, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah. Okay,
cool. Yeah, I was just saying one way maybe to sum this up is that for me is like if we are each an ecosystem, it's like it maybe doesn't matter that we have 3 parts water to 2 parts this to 1 part this. It's like whatever happens to be in balance for us and supports life in a good way, in the ecosystem that is us. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's the healthy expression of who we are, as opposed to we have 5 parts one thing and 0 parts everything else, and it's all going to die because you can't live only on whatever air or only on water. But the right ratio, the right balance is going to be different for every circumstance. I don't know, I'm getting like way into the weeds of this metaphor, but but that's the image coming to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is kind of like an ecosystem, really. And I think we're all, and it's even sort of like represented, we're trying to find homeostasis and achieve balance. And it's like everybody sort of we all have sort of different ways of getting there because we're all starting maybe from different places, but we all sort of have to try to strive for the same kind of middle ground.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind if we just pause super quick? So we can wrap up.
Okay, great. So what do you want to tell us about what you do and what you offer and how people can connect with you and all that?
Well, I'm, taking consultations. You can book a consultation with me at my website. It's kylepierceastrologer.com. I'll be offering like electional astrology as well here in the near future, but primarily I do, mainly natal consultations.
What's electional?
What can electional? So electional astrology is where, say you wanted to pick a time and a date for your wedding. The idea is that with electional astrology, you elect that time. You elect like an auspicious time. So maybe you want to place Venus for marriage. You want to place Venus in a nice location of the chart. And, a sign that's going to, not that Venus is incapable of creating good relationships in any sign, strictly speaking. For something like a marriage, we want to give ourselves a boost if we can. So, we maybe would elect a time that if you're creating something new, the chart of the moment, the chart of the beginning of anything will often be very descriptive of that thing. And that can be a business or a marriage. So choosing, that moment in time carefully can, give you a leg up in your affairs.
Got it. Wonderful. So,
and I also host a podcast called Astrology Hotline, where we answer questions about astrology, people's birth charts. You can check that out. We're doing a series right now on just the basics of astrology, sort of a 101 series, bringing on like different astrologers. For Joji was on one of the sets of episodes. I believe Ada Pembroke, who is doing a talk here soon, I think.
Yeah.
We're currently recording with her right now.
Awesome.
So it's been really great. But you can also, if you have like specific questions, you can email us at astrologyhotlinepod@gmail.com, and we will answer your questions on the podcast. So
Cool. And where can people find the podcast itself?
It's available pretty much any podcast app, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, all of them. Just
Perfect.
Astrology Hotline.
Wonderful. Any last thing?
No, I had this last slide that I kind of forgot about, but the whole idea was that it just sort of gives you a sense that, planets, even though they have maybe this nature, they will float kind of within a range. But yeah, that's probably already been well hit upon. So, but yeah, I feel like that's all I got. That's all I had to add.
So much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate you having me on. Can't wait to hear everybody else's talks. Yeah.
And your talk is on an amazing day. It's with Joji, and it's with it's all of the talks on the wholeness of gender, and there's so many wonderful people.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you, Martha. We'll see you soon. I'll see you all at the symposium.
Yay.
All right. Bye.